Okay, so welcome again, guys, to our Environmental Friday guest lecture series. Today, the topic is on water quality and public health. And our speaker is a good friend of mine. And in fact, she is the head of the Office of Clean Water Public Advocate for the state of Michigan. And one of the cool things is that she really supports our program and uh, was happy to become a sponsor of the Environmental Fridays guest lecture series. So we thank you, uh, Ninah, for this. Um, she has a Master of Science degree in administration and a Bachelor of Science in clinical laboratory science. And in addition to her educational background, she has had quite a number of posts, both in public health, emergency response, um, strategic planning. She's worked extensively in this area. So she's well qualified to speak to us today on water quality and public health. The time is yours.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Murray. Thanks for having me. So I'm excited to be here. When Dr. Murray invited me, I said, well, I definitely love to speak to students. I'm always excited when students love or have an interest in science. And so my presentation is going to focus a lot on drinking water and public health and how we're connecting that work. Let me share my screen. All right, are you able to see my screen?
Oh yeah, very clearly.
Okay, great. So as Dr. Murray mentioned, I'm Ninah Sasy and I head the Office of the Clean Water Public Advocate. Today's presentation is really going to focus on, again, looking at that connection between our drinking water and public health. But before we get started, I'm going to spend some time. I know that Dr. Murray gave you an overview of my bio, but I think a lot of that ties into the things that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to reiterate a few things, just talk about public health in general, and then we're going to take a dive into drinking water and how it's monitored. So as he mentioned, I received my Bachelor's of Science from MSU. In high school, I was thinking back and thinking, what were my interests in high school? And it was primarily around biology, but I would say that I gained my love of chemistry while studying at MSU. I think it was my organic chemistry class where I just thought, okay, this clicks and this feels natural. So, whether you're kind of leaning one way in science or the other, that develops over time. And so I would say my undergraduate experience really helped shape, things to come in my professional experience. At MS, when I received my master's, that was more of looking at, again, how can I be a leader in science and what can I do to equip myself and have that balance between knowing the technical information, but also understanding the organizational structure of how things work. And again, that's where in these roles that I'm going to talk about, it's about putting all those different pieces of the puzzle together. So when we think about public health, we traditionally think of a person going to a doctor, you think of clinics in a community, but there are a lot of aspects of public health. Just thinking of my career, I started off as a chemical threat laboratory response exercise coordinator for the Bureau of Laboratories, and that's a state agency. And a lot of the work performed at the lab was centered around analyzing specimens for arsenic, sarin, nerve agent, even analyzing for things like blood and PCBs. So you wouldn't traditionally think that that was a public health aspect, but it is. It's looking at all of those potential chemical exposures that influence the health of a community. I also worked in overseeing vaccine management, and I'm sure you guys are very familiar with that. And that's just, again, making sure that families have that protection, as we progress and as we interact with folks in our community, making sure that we have those antibodies because there's a lot of different viruses and things out there. And then more recently, before assuming this role, I was a senior strategy manager and looking at maternal and infant health mortality rates. So looking at those drivers that, are that may influence the rate that moms and babies die during childbirth. So again, all of those things, if you're monitoring the flu rates like we're doing right now with COVID, vaccines, drinking water, all of those things feed into the health of a community. So my current role right now, so the Governor Whitmer created my office in 2019. And it was a result of the Flint water crisis that had us reestablish our former department. It was Department of Environmental Quality, and make an expansion of that. Make sure that it had more of a more obvious public health component to it. And within the revamping of that department was the creation of my office. So again, the Clean Water Public Advocate, and also the Office of the Environmental Justice Public Advocate. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. So in my role, it's to make sure that, again, residents have the information needed to protect themselves. If you don't get anything from this presentation, is that knowledge is power. The information that you have and the questions that you ask ultimately help protect you and your family and your community. So having this background knowledge and knowing what questions to ask is key. Sort of like going to the doctor, you can't assume that the doctor is going to know everything about your personal history. You have to ask questions. If you don't understand something, you have to make sure they have that pertinent information up front. And that's my role, is to make sure that we have that voice of the community at the table as we're thinking about these statewide efforts to improve water quality. A lot of my other work is centered around bringing all these partners together. So looking at our state partners within health and human services, looking at our schools and the drinking water within your facility, looking at all those different aspects and saying, what can we do collectively? How can we pool those resources to make sure that we have an impact and that we're ultimately addressing any potential risks? And again, I mentioned before the creation of the office by the governor. Another neat thing is that this is a type 1 agency that I oversee. So I'm able to push back on state departments and say, hey, these are things that we can consider, and then escalate those to the governor as needed. So again, thinking about the larger scheme of things of what I do on a day-to-day basis, it's about improving communication. So if you have a water quality issue in your community, the key is that your community water supplier must notify you. You should know what's going on so that you can either use a filter or do whatever necessary precaution to protect yourself. But it's also about communication between our local partners and knowing what resources are needed. So I'm really tasked with making sure that those communication channels are open on every end and that the right people are in the right room talking to each other. That also ties into supporting community efforts and connecting resources, like I said before, and making sure, that we have the right funding, the right people at the table to tackle these issues within community. And then I think the key is just, again, ensuring transparency as we think about, a lot of things centered around environmental health and public health in general. People want access to data. They want to know what they need, what they need to do to protect themselves. And so the key is to make sure that as state partners, we're providing our long-term strategy and our short-term strategy so that people know where we're going, how we're using those state and federal funds to help their communities. So Dr. Murray mentioned that we've worked together on a few efforts, and one I'd like to talk about is through the Focus on Water initiative, and that's some work we're doing in Benton Harbor. So they're a community that has had a lead action level exceedance. And again, I'll talk about these terms as we progress through the presentation. But essentially that is having more than 12 parts per billion of lead within their drinking water. And that's typically associated with having a large volume of lead service lines. So the line that leads to your house is made out of lead or has lead components. And so what we're doing there is just really using all the resources available to make sure that residents know what they can do, know that this is an issue that has been identified, what they can do, and how we're addressing it long term. So again, I just wanted to talk through, again, something that may be a little bit more relatable. I know that you guys are in Berrien Springs, so it may be a little bit different, but a little bit down the road in Benton Harbor, these are some of the things that we're working on. So now I'm going to spend some time just going over drinking water. I want to talk about how it's monitored, get into the nitty gritty, which you may be really excited about, how the testing, what we're doing to ensure that your water is clean, and also just how you can proactively find information. You know, before we started, Dr. Murray and I were talking about this, you know, how you receive your water. And my understanding is there may be some folks on the call, some families on the call that receive their water through a private residential well, meaning you don't get a bill. You have a private well that you have to maintain. You do the testing for it. If you have any issues, you reach out to your local health department. And then there may be some families that receive it through a community water supplier. And so that's typically if you receive a bill and it comes through, it goes through a treatment plant. And those are I'm gonna focus primarily on community water supplies because there's a lot of monitoring and things associated with that. But before we get started, I wanna show you a video because I think that's gonna really help you identify, again, where you receive your water and give you that background information. Right now, I'm just, I'm gonna pull up this video on the Clean Water site. And this was actually one of the links that I sent over to you. Sent you a link to this site. I'm not sure if you had a chance to watch the video. So if you did, I apologize for the redundancy. But for those that may not have stumbled upon these two videos, I wanted to take some time again for you to see, you know, and get a brief overview. They're pretty short videos. They're going to talk about community water supplies and what that means, and then private household or private residential wells.
The audio and the video is not coming through.
Yeah.
So I think when you share your screen, if you hit the green share button, there's a checkbox in the lower left window that says share computer audio. That should fix the problem.
Share computer.
Okay.
Okay, I see that now.
Yeah, okay.
Hey, this is My Environment,
and we're drinking water experts.
Have you ever turned on your faucet and wondered how the water gets there?
The answer depends on if you have a private well in your yard. It looks like this. If not, your water probably comes from a community water supply. Let's learn more. Start the clock.
Did you know there are approximately 1,400 community water supplies serving over 7 million people?
But where does the water come from? Well, the water may come from a lake, river, or an underground aquifer, also known as groundwater. To get to your faucet, water moves through your community in a water main. The water main branches out in different directions, kind of like a grid or a maze. Every grid looks different depending on where you live, but they all have big and small pipes that send water where it needs to go.
When the water gets to your home, it travels from the water main, through a service line, past the water meter, and into your home's plumbing. The water is regularly tested by a laboratory to check for harmful bacteria and chemicals. To find out what's in your water, look in your annual water quality report or call your water supply.
For more information about drinking water, check out our website.
And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more episodes of My Environment.
Thanks for watching.
Hi, this is My Environment,
and we're drinking water experts.
Have you ever turned on your faucet and wondered how the water gets there?
The answer depends on if you have a private well in your yard. It looks like this. If so, you're in the right place. Let's learn more. Start the clock.
Did you know there are over 1 million private household wells in Michigan?
Some wells can be 25 feet deep, but other wells can be 500 feet deep.
The first step to constructing a well is to drill deep into the ground until you find a layer that contains water. That's called an aquifer.
You can stop there if you want to get all your water with a rope and a bucket.
Or you can get help from our friend Wellard.
Wellard is our water well model. Check this out. By installing a pump, the water can be lifted from the bottom of the well all the way up here.
That's called a pitless adapter.
Through a pipe.
Called a service line.
Into a pressure tank.
Yours might be in a basement or a closet.
This tank keeps the water pressurized, and when you turn on your tap in the kitchen or bathroom, the pressure drops in the tank.
That's how Wellard knows when to pump more water.
For more information on water wells, call your local health department or check out our website.
And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more episodes of My Environment. Thanks for watching.
Awesome.
And those are pretty entertaining videos, but they're quick and to the point.
You were having some fun.
Yeah, I can't take credit for creating those. Those have been clearly for a few years.
All right.
Well, I'm gonna dive right back into my presentation. Again, the intent is for us to understand, because that's the key in knowing how your water is monitored, is knowing where you receive it from. So right now, my presentation is going to focus on if you receive water from a community water supplier. So I'm going to cover the Safe Drinking Water Act. I'm going to talk about the lead and copper rule. I'm going to introduce you to the concept of an action level exceedance and what that means. And then I'm going to talk about a consumer confidence report and how that can really be helpful for you. All right, so with this slide, this really shows you the gamut of everything involved in getting water to you. As I mentioned in the video, you know, there's the source water collection. Well, when we think about monitoring, all of these different aspects are tested. So we're talking about testing source water. We're talking about the treatment plant that may provide, may incorporate different chemicals to make sure that there aren't bacterial contaminants or other contaminants within your water. That's tested. Also the distribution system. So again, when they talked about the lines that actually take the water from the treatment plant to your home, that's what we mean when we talk about distribution system. So the service lines that lead into your home and provide you water. And then the end result is you consuming water. And I always start off by saying, you know, we really don't realize how much we rely on water until something happens to our water. So until there's a potential contaminant, like we use it, you know, when we wake up in the morning to brush our teeth, to take a shower, to cook, you know, all those different things. We clean our hands throughout the day, and especially during this pandemic, we probably clean our hands a lot more, you know, but we really don't think about how that's impacted. Well, in communities like, you know, Flint and PFAS communities and lead action level exceedance communities, the way they think about water is a little bit different. And that's because of, you know, them understanding or knowing the impacts of, you know, what water contamination can do. But there's also some myths as associated with, you know, being in a community where there is a lead action level exceedance or there is PFAS contamination. You can definitely use it for cleaning your hands, and you should. It's just not potable, meaning that, again, there has to be some steps taken before you should consider consuming it. So let's take a look at the Michigan Safe Drinking Water Act. So in 1974, the US Congress passed the Safe Drinking Water Act. This act gave the US Environmental Protection Agency, so the EPA, responsibility for establishing and enforcing drinking water standards nationwide. So the Michigan State Drinking Water Act is Public Act 399. And I sent you a link to that as one of the pre-readings. That was enacted a couple years later in 1976. And that enables the Michigan Department of Environmental, Great Lakes, and Energy to oversee public drinking water programs in the state. The State Drinking Water Act regulates water supplies in many ways. So again, it's not private residential wells, but we're talking about those community water supplies. And I listed those over here on this slide when we talk about monitoring and reporting, and drinking water standards, notification of the public, on-site inspections, all of these are components of that Safe Drinking Water Act. With monitoring and reporting, public water supplies must conduct sampling. That means take samples and analyze them and report the results back to the regulatory agency. Regulations require testing for bacteria, metals, volatile and synthetic compounds, PFAS, radiological contaminants, and other substances. So water supplies that perform water treatment must also submit monthly operation reports. So that was that slide again. If you think to that previous slide, all the different aspects of testing, you know, when you're at that water treatment plant, there's testing there. Like I mentioned, there's testing at the source. There's testing when it's delivered, you know, through those service lines to your home. All of those different aspects are tested. Another thing that I wanted to point out is just the on-site inspection. So in-depth water supply inspections called sanitary surveys are conducted periodically by EGLE or local health departments. And that's when they come into a facility and they check how things are operating. They make sure that you have the technical staff there. They're looking at how the facility looks in terms of cleanliness and how it's operating. And based on those inspections, there may be violations issued, there may be recommendations made. But all of these are aspects of making sure that consumers have, you know, clean water that's delivered to their home. The lead and copper rule is something that you probably heard a lot about, especially post-Flint. And I wanted to spend quite some time kind of walking you through what that means. So one of the most notable takeaways of the lead and copper rule is the sampling requirement. So lead and copper is essentially, the rule establishes an action level for lead and copper based on the 90th percentile level of tap water samples. And action level exceedance is not a violation, but triggers other requirements to reduce exposure to lead and copper in drinking, including water quality parameter monitoring, corrosion control treatment, source water monitoring and treatment, public education, and ultimately lead service line replacement is the goal. But with this lead and copper rule, I'd like to really point out that it is more stringent than the federal lead and copper rule within the Drinking Water Act. And that's as a result, again, as I said, is what the state learned based on the Flint water crisis. So when we think about this item right here that I've highlighted and the collection of sampling. So again, we're looking at homes that receive their water through a lead service line, meaning there's lead within that service line that delivers it. We want to make sure that a 1st liter sample is collected and a 5th liter sample is collected. So when you get this kit in the mail, you would get 5 of these 1 liter bottles. You'd fill the first one and you continuously fill till you get to the 5th one. What that 1st liter is going to tell you is the amount of lead within the home. So it's looking at the plumbing within the home. That 1st liter is just going to capture, you know, what is potentially in your interior plumbing, what's in your faucet. That 5th liter is going to get you out to the service line. By then you kind of reach out and see what's stagnant in that service line. And that was something that we learned that was most important, is to make sure that we're getting that 1st and 5th liter so that we can have a comprehensive look at the picture. Another key aspect or major change with the lead and copper rule is requiring community water supplies to inventory all leads or all service lines. As this picture right here details, service lines can be made of many types of materials. Some are plastic, some are lead, some can be copper and plastic. You know, there's galvanized, there's so many different combinations of what the service line could be made out of. And based on that, there's different precautions that we want that consumer to make. And so in January 1st of 2020, so earlier this year, we required community water supplies to submit their preliminary inventory, so their estimate. So based on what they know, where do you think there are lead service lines? Where do you think these are, where are these other categories? But then by 2025, we're saying we want an accurate count of what you have in regards to service line material. So you have 5 years to go and test and tell us and report back to the state as to what the service line material makeup is for all of your customers within your community. The next thing I'd like to point out is the requirement of a complete lead service line replacement. So in some states, they allow, folks to come out and replace a portion of the lead of the service line. And essentially they were saying, okay, here's the property boundary right here. We're going to replace this part right here because that's public. And then you can be responsible for replacing this. Well, we now know that that increases basically contamination of lead. Once we replace this, then we disturb the system. And now if you have lead, then you're more at risk than you were if we hadn't done that. So what we're saying is you must replace the entire thing. So that means digging all of this up and replacing this until you get into the interior of the home. That entire service line, if it's lead, must be replaced. I talked earlier about, the parts per billion and what it takes to be an action lead, what value is needed for it to be an action lead or lead action level exceedance community. And so previously it was 15 parts per billion, and now we're saying if it's 12 parts per billion, then you are considered action lead exceedance community. What I like to point out here though, and I really want to stress this, is that this is not a health standard. It doesn't mean if you have 11 parts per billion that it's safe. It doesn't mean if you have 13, it is unsafe. It just means that it triggers an action. It triggers an action that requires a community water supply to take next steps. So ultimately, there is no safe level of lead in water. So especially if you have a lead service line, you should know, if that information hasn't been reported to you, you should reach out to your water supplier and have that information, because there's precautions, and I talk about those, that you can take to make sure that you're protecting the health of your family. And then also you would want to make sure that you're on that list for lead service line replacement. And then the fifth requirement is public involvement. As we think about all the things that are involved in drinking water, like I mentioned before, you may not even think about it. It just comes to your house and you may not even second guess it. Public involvement is key. So what we said is if you have a water system of more than 50,000 customers, you must form a local water advisory council comprised of community members and other professionals within the water field. And they must come together and basically provide advice on how you can perform lead outreach efforts. And so in communities, again, that have that 50,000 or more, I think Grand Rapids has one. There's quite a few across the state, Saginaw. Again, those local water advisory councils are something that were created as a result of the updates to the lead and copper rule. So a lead action level exceedance, again, is triggered by when we perform the sampling and we know that it's greater than 12 parts per billion. Based on that, these are the things that we recommend, corrosion control, treatment. And essentially what that is so when you have a lead action level exceedance, that's basically the lead is leaching off the pipes. These pipes are maybe 50 to 100 years old. And so as the water changes, the characteristics of the water changes, those attribute to the different materials within the pipe leaching into the water. So what corrosion control does is it stabilizes that a little bit more so that that lead isn't leaching into the water as much. So that's what I mean when we talk about corrosion control treatment. We also, if you have a lead action level exceedance, require public education. So usually communities will have public meetings where they're sharing, this is what you should do. We have the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services that comes in and they sample homes, meaning they go into homes, they collect samples, and based on what they analyze, they say, this is how long on average you should flush your water in your home. And what flushing is opening up a faucet. It means letting the water run, letting it, I believe in Ben Harbor, we're saying the water has to run for at least 2 minutes. Now, from a conservation perspective, you may say, okay, well, that seems a little bit wasteful, but we want to make sure, again, you're flushing out those contaminants. So things that you can do, to flush your home is you can run your dishwasher. Again, you don't have to worry about eating food from a plate that's been cleaned, you know, with water from a lead action level. Exceedance community, you can wash your clothes. But more importantly, we say any tap has to be run that you plan to use for consumption for at least 2 minutes there. And then again, lead service line replacement, getting that primary source of lead removed and replaced is key. Another thing I like to point out, because I've talked about replacing the service line, is that in older homes, and I can't even say older homes because this is a new requirement, but in some of your fixtures themselves, they may have an abnormally high amount of lead in them. So your water faucet, this is a new thing. So if you have a water faucet that was basically manufactured, I think it's before 2014, then you would want to replace that, or at least, make sure that you flush or using a filter, because again, as we progress in society, we improve. We have instrumentation that allows us to take a better look. And as a result of those fixtures have been replaced. And we're knowing now that they should have a very small amount of lead. And we're not saying that these aren't going to have some, lead components, because ultimately that's needed to hold the different components together at times. But the key is to make sure that we have the minimal amount as possible. So I say all this not to scare you so that you go out and you start drinking bottled water and you're using bottled water for everything, because with that being said, bottled water contains at least 5 parts per billion of lead in it, or potentially. What I'm saying is, again, knowledge is key, and knowing information and knowing how you can be protective of public health is key. If you're in a home where you have a lead service line, then these are the things you want to do. You want to run your faucet. Other ways that you can get the water moving, like I mentioned before, washing dishes, doing laundry. There's also point of use water filters. So there's specific water filters out there that remove lead from your water. You can have an in-house water filtration system. There are different things that you can do to protect yourself. Cleaning your aerators are key. And I'm not sure if you guys know what I mean by the aerators, but I'm talking about the piece at the bottom of the faucet. If you look at your kitchen faucet or your bathroom faucet, there's usually something right before the water gets to you that you can twist off and that you should clean and make sure that it's not building up with particulates. And that's in any case, whether you have a lead action level exceedance or not. Again, you want to make sure that the water that you're receiving is as clean as possible, because we have all these other processes in place, but what you do within your home is key as well. And then we talked about just plumbing in the home, and that was right. Anything so before 2014 can contain up to 8% of lead, even if it's marked lead free, because in those times it was considered, okay, this is the lowest we can get. So keep that in mind as, if you're doing any upgrades or your family are doing any things, or, these are the items that you want to look for as far as replacing, making sure that, again, even if it's in a store, that it's manufactured after 2014. When you, again, water filters, making sure that it's certified to remove lead. So how can you proactively know all of the things that's going on with your water? Well, your consumer confidence report, also called your annual water quality report, provides that information. So again, for every customer that receives their water from a community water supplier, on July 1st, they have to provide this information. Now they can provide it via mail, they can include it with your water bill, they can post it on your website. But if you can't find it, then reach out to me and I'll connect you with the person that can help facilitate that, or reach out to your community water supplier. I want to let you know that I'm here for this reason. Again, the more you know, the better. So this report really gives you a breakdown of all of the things that they're doing in regards to testing. The thought of this is not to gloss and say, hey, here are all the good things. I want you to treat this as a label, like when you go shopping for your food. When you look at the amount of calories, when you look at the amount of fat, that's essentially what this is saying, okay, these are the things that we're doing. These are things that we've identified. These are things that we're approving upon. This is their report to you saying, this is what we're doing to ensure that you have clean water. It's in some cases, it's very technical in nature. And that's where my office is going to be working again with EGLE, so the Department of Environmental Great Lakes and Energy, and local water suppliers or community water suppliers to make sure that this is presented in a way where it's useful to residents. But again, it's basically that report card of what they're doing to make sure that you have clean water. Environmental justice, and I like to end with this. You know, we've talked about drinking water. We talk about how it's monitored, the different protective aspects there. Environmental justice looks at the big picture. If you're in a community where you have air quality issues, soil quality issues, drinking water quality issues, source water issues, those are environmental justice communities. So unfortunately, we have industry and factories that have made mistakes years ago and unfortunately done things to our environment that impact community. If communities like this, you know, they have a lot of different factors that contribute to health. And what I like to say is, if you're not familiar with the Robert Woods Johnson life expectancy model, then that's something you should Google. Where you live can estimate how long you will live, your life expectancy. You can be a couple of streets over, the next city over, and it gives you an estimate of what the average life expectancy is. Now, there's a lot of different aspects that feed into that, but environment is one of them. You have to be aware of what's going on in your environment. There's a lot of advocates out there that are doing the hard work. They're making sure that industry is abiding. We have our regulatory agencies that are ensuring that things are within regulations. But again, you have to be your own advocate. What we're doing at the state level is, I mentioned the creation of another office similar to mine, the Office of the Environmental Justice Public Advocate. That's headed by Regina Strong, who's one of my colleagues. And what she does is she looks at communities that, again, that may be disadvantaged, that have all these different aspects, and looking at the big picture of how can we address these concerns and how they ultimately lead to the health of the community. So again, the takeaway from this slide is be aware of all the different things. Know that there's policies in places. Know at the state level there's regulations, but there's also regulations that have been around for a long time that may need to be updated. And that's where our offices come in and say, hey, maybe these were the standards before, but let's rethink this based on what we're seeing out there. If we're seeing a prevalence of a certain condition, if we're hearing things from our community, that's a key driver into rethinking how we're regulating, how we're enforcing these standards. So for more information about my office, you know, if you want information about drinking water in general, go to michigan.gov/clean water. The videos that I showed you are underwater info. There's information about transparency. So again, leading you to some data sources. But again, if you walk away with anything, it's knowledge is power. Make sure that you understand the different processes in place so that you can ask questions, so that you can be proactive in making sure that you're protecting your health and the health of your community. And another thing is, you know, whether you have an interest in public health, environmental health, or any of the other science careers or other careers, they ultimately feed into the health of the community. Even businesses, all of those things play a key role into making sure that your community is healthy. So that's all I have. I think I made it right to the 8:40, Dr. Murray.
Yes, you did. Yes, thank you very much. Let's give our speaker a round of applause. And you guys could start putting questions into the chat or unmuting your mic, and you could ask her the questions directly. So you have two options, either in the chat or directly. Unmute your mic. So I have a question to begin with. So in the state of Michigan, I'm assuming there are multiple places that does the water analysis and water sampling. Those places have to be all certified, if you will, by the state?
Yes. So there are some laboratories out there that will test your water. But if you want accurate results, your lab should be certified. And we have a list of certified labs out there. The last thing you want is inaccurate information. that either tells you, yeah, you have this contaminant and you don't, or tells you the opposite and you're thinking your water is safe and it isn't. So on the website, the Clean Water site, we have a list of certified labs, but also know that you can, we have our state laboratory. So we have the Michigan Department of Environmental, Great Lakes and Energy, a laboratory that can perform that analysis. And I think they do it at a very reasonable price. And based on the circumstance, you can work with my office and potentially get that for free.
Okay, so any citizen really that has any concern about their water quality could do that. You don't have to go through any sort of local government. You just can connect with these sites, these places.
So I'd like to be, maybe what I should say is, okay, your water, if you receive your water through a community water supply, know that there's testing performed there. So if you look at that consumer confidence report and you're saying, okay, this looks a little bit different, or hey, I think there's something going on in my home, reach out to your local water department.
Okay.
If there's a barrier there, we have the State Department laboratory, we have a list of certified labs, but they should be your first stop. We're regulating them, making sure that, again, they're providing that service to the community. But know that we're here if there's a barrier that you encounter, or if you feel like you're not getting your questions answered, then that's where you would escalate it to the state.
Okay. Hey, Dylan, I see you have a question in the chat. Do you want to unmute your mic?
Yeah, I'm Dylan Zimmerman. I actually live in Ohio. I'm a high school teacher, so I think I'm not a college student anymore. But my question, I think you were addressing it as far as the 2014 issue, but what do they end up replacing the corroded pipes with? Is it just another lead pipe? Do they use copper, PVC, or what?
No. So we definitely wouldn't replace it with lead, and primarily we're using other sources. So we haven't used galvanized. There's been combination materials just to make sure, again, that we have that lower percentage of lead involved in it and in the development of it. But no, we're not replacing a lead with a lead. We're ultimately trying to remove service lines that are primarily made up of lead.
So in terms of the state, do you have a rough idea of how much has to still be removed? Because that sounds like a pretty, large task. Yeah, costly too.
So I will say this. So I'm not sure if you guys have heard about the announcement from the governor. So there was a $500 million investment in water and sewage infrastructure. And so for most people, they're like, wow, that's a lot of money. That's going to make sure that our state is lead free. Well, unfortunately, it's going to help, but it's not going to replace everything. This is replacing lead service lines because there's such a large amount and because it's on average $5,000 per service line to replace it, and the time associated with it, it's gonna take some years. Possibly by in the next 20 years, we're hoping that we'll have the majority, if not all, lead service lines replaced. But unfortunately, it's a marathon. It's going to take some time. And I think that's, again, where we're looking at communities like Ben Harbor, where the majority of their service lines are lead. Now, not every community has lead service lines. If you look at that document that I showed you, there's some, with copper, there's some with plastic. But we know based on our initial inventory that places like Ben Harbor have a large number of lead service lines. And so that's where we're saying, hey, we want to make sure that you have this funding so that you can replace those lead service lines. But yeah, it's going to be a while. And that's why I think it's key to educate the public on what you can do in the meantime. These are things that you can do. You should flush your water. You should use a filter. Those are key. And then when we talk about, these are for community water supplies. When we talk about private residential wells, what you have to keep in mind is that you're essentially your own water operator when you have a private residential well. There isn't someone that comes out and monitors it. You have to, again, reach out to those certified labs, like you mentioned, Dr. Murray. So reach out to those certified labs and say, hey, maybe these are the things I'm seeing, whether it's aesthetically, you see something that changes, or you have some sort of skin sensitivity, or the taste is a little bit different, or you see some things going on as far as side effects. That's where you have to work with your local health department, work with the certified lab, but you're essentially like the project manager of guiding, these are the tests that you should do and then paying for them.
Okay. Hey, Sean, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Within residential areas 50 years or newer, what is more common to find as an issue, copper or lead?
Yes, so it would probably be copper, and then also a lot of newer subdivisions are using plastic, but you won't find lead. Lead is really outdated in regards to service lines. And again, that's why you find that these lead service lines are like 50 to 100 years old. So, and that's why they, you know, when they were installed, it was probably the newest technology of quality and things, but over time and erosion and just what we know about science, we found that again, this is something that we don't want to use as the primary material or composition of service lines.
Okay. Jonathan, you have a question. You want to unmute?
Yeah, how many lead samples are required for action to be taken? Like, you have one test that's above that 12 part per billion action level, will action be taken, or does it require more white samples?
So it's average. That's a very good question. So the way it works is based on the size of your community, that tells you how many you should sample. And so I'm going to Benton Harbor because again, I think it's pretty close to you and I have that information in front of me. Based on their population, they're required to collect 60 samples. They average those 60 samples. And then if the average is over 12 parts per billion, then there's a lead action level exceedance. But the thing is, it doesn't stop there. If we identify in sampling that, hey, there's a home, maybe you don't reach that 12 parts per billion threshold, but there's a couple of homes where we're seeing something that's abnormal. We're seeing it over the 12. You know, we have MDHHS, so the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, come in and they sample those homes. So you're protected in that way of knowing, okay, yeah, there's a bigger picture of saying your community has a lead action level exceedance, and this is what we're recommending broadly. But also those individual homes that are sampled, we follow up with those as state partners and say, hey, this is what we want you to do within your home, because even though your community may not have this issue, we've noted that when we sampled your home.
Okay. Anybody else has questions? I have one last question too. Could you remind us about that Robert Woods Johnson? Is it Robert Woods Johnson again?
Yep, it's Robert Wood Johnson life expectancy predictor, and it's a map where you can, you know, find your zip code and just it compares it to other communities, and it tells you what the average life expectancy is. But I've been using that, you know, in my other work too, especially with infant and maternal mortality. But I think with environment, I mean, that's a key aspect too. But keep in mind, it doesn't mean that you have an environmental justice issue, but it's that broader thing of how all these things come together to impact the health of your community and essentially how long you will live.
So you could easily find that online, Robert Woods Johnson life expectancy.
Yeah. And I'll email it to you after this meeting too, just in case you do have some issues finding it. But yeah, it's bookmarked for me, so I can shoot it.
Okay. Yeah, I think that could make a pretty interesting assignment. That's what I'm thinking.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you very much. There's one more question. Have standards been made for average pipeline service lifetimes? Have standards been made for average pipeline service lifetimes?
Yeah, so basically have studies been made to figure out like roughly how long does a pipe stay in service before it starts getting corroded? Or is there like a standard that's been set by this time roughly a pipe breaks down enough that a critical level of contaminants is coming into the water?
Okay.
There is an average, but I'm going to tell you, like, the piping system is sort of like the human body, and there's so many different factors that influence it. So if you have, you know, just thinking of your neighborhood, if your neighbor goes out and they do this, you know, they install an underground pool and they're doing all this landscaping, they're disturbing the equilibrium of, you know, your community water system. So all of the construction, all these different things. So we have an estimated value, but there's so many factors. So you can't directly say, okay, well, we know this pipe is going to need to be replaced, or we know this service line is going to need to be replaced. We can estimate the best that we can. And that's what the local water, the community water suppliers do when they say, hey, okay, we think it's time for us to replace this water main or this service line just based on the average usage. But you can even go in to replace it and say, oh, okay, we didn't realize this was going on because there's so many factors going on within this specific block or something. So again, I like to say, like, your environment, your community is like the human body. Like, you can say, hey, you know, when would you expect for this to happen? But every community, every neighborhood is different. There's so many different factors. And even just having an industry, like a factory or something in your community can, you know, impact when something should be replaced, because maybe they're utilizing it more than a resident would. But yeah, that's a good question. We do have the averages, but there's so many variables that impact it that we have to keep those in mind.
Okay, very good. Thank you again very much. We all would like to give you a round of applause.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for having me. I apologize, I'm a little squeaky. I was telling Dr. Murray I've been dealing with some sinus issues over here, so.
It's all good. It didn't come through. All right. We'll talk to you.
Thanks, take care.
All right, bye-bye.